Welcome to the Head Shepherd podcast. I'm your host, Mark Ferguson, CEO here at NextGen Agri International, where we help livestock managers get the best out of their stock. Before we get started, thank you to our two fantastic sponsors for continuing to sponsor this podcast. MSD Animal Health is perhaps better known as Cooper's Animal Health in Australia and for their Allflex range across the world, with a comprehensive suite of animal health and management products. Honiger is a one-stop shop for wool harvesting and animal fibre removal. The Honiger team have a deep understanding of livestock agriculture, backed by Swiss engineering and a family business dedicated to manufacturing the best. We are grateful to our sponsors for their support, helping us bring Head Shepherd to you each week. And now it's time to get on with this week's episode. Welcome back to Head Shepherd. Hope you're having a great day. Great to have you listening along. This week on the show, we've got Dr. Pedro Fontes from the University of Georgia, actually in the US. We're talking all things reproductive physiology in cattle. Pedro is originally from Brazil, but now based there in the US. A long career in sort of reproductive performance in beef cattle. So we have a good chat about bulls and cows and talk about AI programs and a whole range of stuff. So we'll get to that in a second. For those watching along on the hub, this week we've put an article up from Dr. Amy Lockwood from our team over in Western Australia. Amy did her PhD in mob size, and so altering mob sizes to improve lamb survival. So basically subdividing paddocks down to decrease mob size. You get a few benefits from that, and Amy writes through them in her article. A great little read to really summarise that power of splitting those paddocks. So you can have the same number of ewes in the same paddock, you split it in half, and you get an improvement in lamb survival. Lots of opportunity across the larger sheep producing areas to get those mob sizes down, particularly in multiples, particularly those twin bearing mobs, triplet mobs, where you get a lot of confusion from lots of lambs being around. And Amy's PhD showed that there's a lot of gain to be had, and that most of that is economic gain. So yeah, jump on the hub, have a read, and let us know what you think. Righto, we'll get underway with this week's show with Dr. Pedro Fontes. Welcome, Dr. Pedro Fontes, to Head Shepherd.
Well, hello, Mark. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you, and it's great to be again chatting with someone in the US and where the beef industry is a seriously big deal, and great to be learning from people like yourself that are doing great work over there. So we'll cut to the chase. I think it'll be good to start, I guess, with your background. You grew up in Brazil, and your family run a cow-calf operation there. It'd be good just to, I guess, understand a bit about that and the Brazilian beef industry is something we heard a lot about, but never actually spoken directly to someone that's from there.
Yeah, no, sure. I am from São Paulo, Brazil, so the state of São Paulo, which is in the southeastern portion of the country. And yep, my family runs a commercial cow-calf operation. We still do in the southeast part of the country. I actually grew up in a city, right, in the city of São Paulo, and my dad is actually a lawyer. But on the side, we ran a group of commercial cows not far from there. So growing up, I pretty much spent every weekend and vacation going to the farm, and always working with beef cattle since then. And then from that exposure, I kind of geared my career away from São Paulo, from the city of São Paulo. And yeah, I've been working with beef cattle since then. So I went to vet school in Brazil. So I got my DVM at São Paulo State University, and then I did my graduate work here in the US at University of Florida. And then my PhD was at Texas A&M. Since then, I moved to my current position. So I've been with the University of Georgia for 5 years now in a beef specialist type of position, working predominantly with beef cattle reproduction. We do a little bit of everything within the realm of reproduction. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, well, which is where we're going to focus about the, I guess, tips that things that you're working on currently that to help US beef producers to improve their reproductive efficiency.
Sure, we do a little bit of everything. Ranging from some basic things on the educational side, working with producers. But not only that, we also try to, move knowledge forward and try to do some research as well. So our program has research ranging from tweaks in large-scale synchronization and fixed-time artificial insemination program. We've been doing a lot of things on the embryo recipient selection side of things as well. And more recently, we've also been doing some bull fertility work, predominantly focusing on overnutrition, right? And those yearling beef bulls that sometimes get pushed a little bit too hard from a dietary standpoint, and they get a little bit overconditioned. So we've been doing a little bit of that as well.
Cool. Right. Well, we'll go through those in some sort of order, but I guess right now, fixed time AI is sort of gaining a bit of traction around the month. It's obviously been used a lot, but I guess a lot of commercial producers considering using it in their heifers, particularly for a range of reasons. What have you got? Any tips or tweaks that you've made recently that people across the other side of the world could implement?
Yeah, one of the things that we've seen done a lot here now is traditionally we always try to minimize the number of trips to the chute in those synchronization and fixed time AI programs. But since those programs became well established around 10 to 15 years ago, the early adopters of it, they are actually willing to potentially run cows through the chute one more time if they can capture some additional fertility. And we have seen a lot of research here in the US in the last 5 years or so with pre-synchronization programs, kind of similar to what has been done pretty thoroughly in the dairy industry. But we try to make it in a way that we minimize the number of trips to the chute, but basically pre-synchronizing both heifers and cows so that they respond a little bit better to the synchronization programs. And we're seeing that we are able to capture some pregnancies when we do that. So if you go
talk me through what that means, like what would a program look like?
Yeah, sure. So probably still today the most commonly utilized synchronization program in beef herds in this country is what we call the 7 days co-sync, right? Which is basically you put a CIDR or progesterone intravaginal device in, give a GnRH injection, and then 7 days later you pull that progesterone device out, give a prostaglandin injection, and then 54 to 66 hours later, depending on whether you're working with cows or heifers, that's when you would schedule your fixed time AI, right? And basically what a few groups here in the US have been trying to do is basically optimize the response to that initial GnRH. So if we think about physiologically, the role of that GnRH is to induce ovulation in as many females as possible, right? So they start what we would call a new follicular wave in a somewhat synchronized manner after that GnRH injection. What we see is in cows, we only get about 60% of the cows to respond to that GnRH. And in heifers, the number is even less. So only about 30 to 40% of those females respond to the GnRH. So what that does is that if they fail to respond, their next follicular wave, the wave that, the wave of follicular development that is going to ovulate the follicle we're interested in, right? It's usually lacking a little bit of synchrony there. And what we notice is we can do some pre-synchronization steps that focus on optimizing the GnRH response. And the one that has been working really good here, we're seeing quite a lot of adoption, is actually what you see in the industry people calling the 7 and 7 sync, which is basically going in about 7 days earlier and introducing a CIDR in or your intravaginal progesterone device in and giving a shot of prostaglandin. Okay, and what that will do is that will make a greater proportion of cows and heifers as well to have a large dominant follicle whenever we're giving a GnRH 7 days later, right? So it's the same as the traditional 7-day program that I just went over. The only difference is the CIDR goes in 7 days earlier than it normally would, and we give a prostaglandin injection at the same time. So one more trip to the chute, everything else moving forward within the protocol schedule remains the same. And we've been able to, some different research programs have been able to show both in cows and heifers about a 10% increase in pregnancy rates in large scale trials, like trials with about 1,500 head, both in conventional and sex semen too. So,
yeah, right. So the prostaglandin knocks off the corpus luteum, so it ends the previous ovulation, so it brings them into one synchrony, and then obviously then you're building from there.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. We give that prostaglandin, so we bring progesterone down, so follicle grows, and we put a CIDR in earlier so they don't ovulate before they're supposed to. So that follicles keep growing until 7 days later they form what some could call a persistent follicle there, that whenever you give that GnRH, we know that the response to the GnRH is really dependent on the follicle size. So when we use that pre-synchronization step, we can really increase follicle size and optimize that ovulatory response.
Yeah, right. So maybe I'm slow, but the seed is coming out after 7 days, or it stays in 14 days in that program?
Yeah, so in that program, they stay 14 days. The
Yeah.
seeder will stay for 14 days. So
Cool.
we put it in a week earlier, and whenever it's time to give the GnRH, we just keep that seeder in. We don't replace that seeder for a new one, or we don't take it out. We keep it in.
Yeah. So prostaglandin seeder 7 days later, GnRH, and then seeder out 7 days after that
Correct.
with another. And then what's the jab
Prostaglandin.
on prostaglandin then? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Right,
and then the timing between the seeder removal and prostaglandin and AI stays the same as the 7-day program, and it works really well.
Yeah.
A lot of hits in that program. Yeah.
So what sort of conception rates is that getting you up to in a good outcome? I know it's a very variable game. Reproduction.
It is. Huge range between operations, right? But what we do see is somewhat consistently around between 8 to 11% above what you would normally get with the 7 days. So if you're running a group of commercial beef cows, that usually will give you 55%. Whenever we introduce that pre-sync step, we usually get closer to 65%. And you know how much it varies from herd to herd, right? There are herds that we work with that they're consistently on the 70s and the high 60s. And there's some herds that we work with, they're consistently in the low 50s too. So quite a variation there, but we see a consistent improvement across most herds when we use that pre-sync step.
Is there widespread use of fixed time AI across the US?
Not as much as I'd like to. I think I think we're still struggling to get more folks to adopt the technology. The technology is really clear, right? It delivers performance. It delivers increased fertility. We get more cows pregnant early. We know that the performance of the calves increase as well. I mean, we can show that for most operations, you can capture dollars by utilizing the technology. But still, from an industry standpoint, only about 11% of the cow-calf herds utilize AI in this country. Okay, that's not a perfect depiction of the adoption of the technology, because there's a lot of people that don't truly run cows incorporating those surveys, right? They have 5, 6 cows, and they might respond to a survey like this. But it's interesting that if you break down based on the size of the operation, like the folks that are running more than 100, 150 cows, that number of utilization of AI will bump to a little bit over 30%. So, within the folks that are really running cows, the real producers, the adoption is a little bit higher.
Yeah, cool. What is that? That's always intrigues me about the US industry. I think probably romantically think of the US as having these big ranches and big cow herds, and maybe most of us only know what we know from Yellowstone, but there is lots of small operators in the US, isn't there? Like lots of small herds of cows. There
are actually about 70% of the cow-calf producers in the US have less than, I think, trying to remember the survey exactly, but I think it's less than 50 or less than 30% of their income coming from the farm. So we have a lot of people that are not full-time ranchers, right? So, and that putting aside the folks that might farm, right? They might be in country that they can, grow row crops and also run cows at the same time. But we have a lot of people that might have a job in town, and they will have 20, 40 cows as an additional source of income or as a hobby as well. So every time we look at whole pictures from the U.S. beef industry, we always have to be careful of who is actually running cows for a living and who's not, as we think about adoption of technology and things like that. Overall, I think folks are, in general, very progressive from a technology adoption standpoint. And it really depends on the segment of the industry as well. So in the cow-calf segment, rate of adoption of technology is less. But as you start moving forward and people that are running stockers or people that are actually in the feedlot segment of the industry, we see a gradual increase in the size of the operations and the adoption of technologies as well, mostly in the feedlot side.
You talked about those benefits of fixed time AI. What's if we add them up, where does the value come from? So if you're sitting down with a producer thinking about it, it's that the fact that you get on average an earlier calving date, I guess you got access to better calving ease bulls and just generally better. Obviously, you can go to the top end of bull rather than something that you can afford. So, is that what are the other benefits that you pick up in a fixed time AI program?
Yeah, sure. So I personally think that one of the main benefits is that shifting in the timing of pregnancy. Right, we get those cows; they're not cycling. Those synchronization programs allow us to get those cows pregnant. Right.
Yeah.
So what we see over time with producers that we work with that start using the technology is that shift in calving distribution. So you increase proportion of cows calving early in the season, and here in the U.S., most people are going to be weaning calves between 6 or 8 months of age. So those calves are going to be around 200, 210 days old. So if you think about a program or getting cows pregnant 20 days earlier, right? So if those calves are gaining 2 to 2.5 pounds a day, if they got pregnant about 20 days earlier, you're capturing $40 there.
Yeah.
$40 on 40 pounds.
Yeah.
Right now, cattle prices are really high here, so 40 pounds is worth a lot.
Yeah.
But even when cattle prices are low, usually that added performance just from a shifting calving distribution covers the synchronization and the semen cost. And just like you said, there's also the benefits of the genetics, widespread availability of bulls, no matter what trait as a producer you're interested in, you can find the top bull of whatever breed you're using to utilize in your herd in a pretty affordable way. So the genetics and the calving distribution side of things are outstanding benefits from a production standpoint.
Excellent. One thing that intrigues me here, anyway, is the dominance of Angus, which has happened through a beautiful marketing campaign and pretty globally, and so now price premiums for high proportion Angus, which has probably seen a reduction in the use of hybrid vigor or heterosis, people more going to purebred programs. Is that a trend that's happening in the US and or are you still capturing? Or are people still using hybrid vigor to its full advantage, which seems like a great opportunity in beef production?
I don't think they're using to their full advantage, but you see a lot of crossbreeding here, right? We have on the commercial side, you see a lot of people leveraging crossbreeding. But you're right. I think maybe you see more, what we would call purebred, but it might not be registered cattle, but purebred commercial herds, right? They're going to be completely black-hided cows, predominantly Angus-based, Sem-Angus cows. Yeah. And there's a lot of opportunity for people to leverage crossbreeding on that side, both from an offspring performance standpoint, a direct effect of crossbreeding and that offspring calf, but also when you keep replacements, right? From a cow herd performance, we know that best way to improve fertility in a cow herd is to leverage crossbreeding, right? So, and heterosis. So a lot of opportunities there to utilize crossbreeding. And, if we go back to the beginning of our conversation and think about size of operations, crossbreeding can become quite challenging, right? Mainly if you're developing your own heifers, right? Your own replacement heifers, and you want to produce a terminal product that you can sell. It's hard to do that and generate those replacement heifers that are crossbred. So I think there's some opportunities for some producers to specialize themselves, to generate some more maternal lines, to sell bred replacement heifers. And we see that. Folks that maybe have the opportunity of running a little bit more cows to produce good maternal replacements. Another big concern we see here is excessive selection for terminal traits too. So we're seeing a huge increase in the size of the cow herd, and something that the industry is realizing, and folks are starting to hold back on size of females they're keeping a little bit. So
selection for early growth, obviously, and carcass attributes has sort of overridden the focus on on fertility and in this part of the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah, and it's funny because I'm in an extension position. We go there and we use our examples of 1,000 to 1,200 pound cows, right? And then when you go there and you run cows through the chute, through the scale, it's hard to find those, right? They're all 1,400 pounds, and we need to adapt our environment to meet the requirements of those bigger cows, and there's a cost associated with that. So, yeah.
And the selection strategy. So if you are talking to those producers that have those 1,400 pound cows, what are they? I guess we've got mature cow weight breeding values, but we're concerned that you just end up with you can end up with just selecting for a skinny cow if you're not careful. So what's the strategy to cap mature weight that people are typically doing?
They're not doing, to be honest, they're not doing.
Okay.
Not a lot. There's few people that realize that trend, and they're trying to overcome that. But ultimately, the best way to make improvements is on the sire side, right? If you want to really shift genetics, putting selection pressure on your replacement heifers and your cow herd is good. But what's really going to make a difference is the bull that you're going to select.
Yeah.
So the opportunities that folks have are within from a genetic selection standpoint, is just like you said. We have mature weight trait, right, or EPD, and then the dry matter intake EPD as well. We see some producers starting to watch those a little bit more.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot for us to learn. If you think about feed efficiency from a trait standpoint, at least in the Angus breed, the trait is the residual average daily gain, right? It's the metric of efficiency that we have. I think we need to learn a lot about to what extent that's influencing feed efficiency on the cow size. I think the cow feed efficiency side of the equation is a big black box. We know very little about it. And there's some research groups working on it now, and hopefully we're going to learn a little bit more moving forward. But yeah, all our selection for feed efficiency is focused on that growing animal. So we need to figure out to what extent that works for a cow that is physiologically quite different, right? A cow that is grazing, sometimes very low quality forages, right? And she's not necessarily growing, she's producing milk, and she's trying to breed back. So it's a different beast. And I think there's some room for improvement there.
Yeah, and that is my favourite topic. So we could talk about that particular one for hours, because I do think we've got this massive influence or massive interest in feed efficiency, and it's obviously measured typically in a growing animal. It's very difficult to measure. We haven't really mastered measuring what's happening out there when they're eating that low quality forage, and what's actually happening in that breeding cow, which for the majority of herds is the key bit, particularly here in New Zealand, where beef cattle don't get to see high quality pasture very often. They're often up in, their job is to push around in the hills and eat sort of rough tucker, and do a great job of doing that and turning that low quality forage into money. And it's sort of, we've got to be really careful that we don't end up, I guess, selecting for feedlot traits in a cow that needs to be out running around, walking around a mountain. But you talked about crossbreeding quickly, and you talked about the influence of that on the maternal performance, as in an F1 is a key way of improving reproductive performance. Have you got a metric on sort of what typically hybrid vigor does or heterosis does for reproduction in cattle?
I would love to give you a number, but I'm not sure if I won't know by the top of my head a number that I can relate back from the studies that evaluated that in a controlled manner. But what we do see is increase in longevity and an increase in fertility, right? Yeah. And ultimately longevity for a commercial herd, longevity of that cow is probably one of the main drivers, if not the main driver of whether that cow as a production unit is profitable or not. So if we can get one more calf out of that cow, the economic impact of that is huge.
Yeah.
So So, but
What?
I don't have a specific number
Yeah,
that I can
no,
think
that's
of by
what
the top of my head.
I could stop being lazy and look up the papers. It'd be fine.
Yeah, it's going to be somewhere between 3 to 5, no more than 10%
Yeah, yeah,
advantage, which is already big.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Cow longevity is obviously incredibly important. The cost of getting a cow heifer through to her first calving and successful first calving is pretty expensive when you think about all the feed that you have to do to get her up. And then once she's there, obviously, the longer you can keep her in that herd, the more money she'll make you. What are they typically leaving the herd from? Are they just going out as in not getting pregnant, or are they going out from failing in some other way?
Yeah, the main reason for cows being called is that they fail to breed within a controlled breeding season.
Yeah, yeah,
And yeah. So that's the main reason for culling. And then from that, you're going to see things. It's going to depend a lot on the producer you're working with, but you're going to see things like structural issues and lack of performance in general.
yeah.
If you have herds that have really high fertility, you start seeing some culling regardless of fertility, right? Let's say if you're above 90% pregnancy rates at the end of a controlled breeding season, and you have someone that developed their own heifers, so they have a surplus of females, right, from their replacement programs. Then you start seeing some culling based on age, regardless of whether those females are getting pregnant or not, or performance in general, right?
Yeah.
The folks that have higher fertility, that have herds with higher fertility, have the luxury to start thinking about some other reasons to cull cows, and they can get a little bit more picky.
Yeah. Cool. You mentioned briefly in your intro around some work on selecting recipients for embryos, and there'll be a few stud breeders out there listening that would be interested in anything you've found in that area.
Sure, yeah. Well, we've been doing a lot of work with an ultrasound technology called color Doppler, which is basically a technology that enables veterinarians and embryologists to detect blood perfusion within specific tissues. And in the case of color Doppler and the recipient selection side of things, we've been using it to evaluate the CL, or the corpus luteum, at the time of transfer, right? So traditionally, folks have either evaluated the CL through palpation or just the general size of the CL based on a conventional ultrasound scan, which is the black and white image, right? A brightness mode type of ultrasound.
Yeah.
And what we've seen, and a lot of work has been done in South America, and we kind of adapted that work to our reality here in the U.S., is that those embryo recipient cows that have higher blood perfusion in the CL, they are more likely to maintain their embryo pregnancy.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so there's a somewhat linear relationship where the larger the luteal blood perfusion, or the CL blood perfusion in the recipient, the larger the probability of the recipient to maintain a pregnancy, which is quite interesting. Sometimes, if people are not familiar with the Doppler technology, or if they've seen Doppler in small animal practice, in those contexts, veterinarians are mostly using, or in humans as well, very often we're using color Doppler or Doppler technology to evaluate large blood vessels, and the examination takes a long time, right? But for the evaluation of embryo recipients, we're basically looking at that CL and evaluating what proportion of that CL has a color Doppler signal. So we're not messing with the machine a whole lot. It's very similar from a time standpoint when we're evaluating that recipient to what normally happens when you just scan the ovary of that cow. Within 5 seconds of a steady image of the CL or the ovary, you can tell the amount of vascularization that CL is. So, sometimes when we're talking to embryologists that are, but I'm transferring 150 embryos in the morning, I won't have time to do that. No, you will. It won't slow you down. So it's a fast exam, and it generates some insight into the ability of the recipients to maintain a pregnancy. And you can use that information whichever way you want. Sometimes, very often, now with in vitro embryo production, right? Sometimes we have a surplus of embryos. So if the recipient is, she might become pregnant, we stick the embryo in, so you don't have to freeze that in vitro produced embryos. In the U.S., we still have a lot of, in the beef side of things, a lot of conventionally produced, right, in vivo produced embryos through superovulation. But still, since we start getting good at cryopreserving embryos, we usually have a surplus of embryos. But if you're in a situation that you have a surplus of embryo recipients, yeah, you can maybe use the blood perfusion information to pick the recipients that are more likely to conceive. But even in a situation where you have a surplus of embryos, there's always those specific matings that you're more interested in, that you really want a pregnancy out. So you can prioritize the recipients with higher luteal blood perfusion to receive those superior embryos from a genetic standpoint that the producer you're working with are more interested in. So there's these few different ways that we can use that to, out there in the field to leverage this technology.
Yeah, cool. And is that something like if that recipient measures well 1 year, is she then a good one next year, or it's particular to that particular corpus luteum?
We don't know, to be quite honest. We don't know. I think it's probably going to vary. I think it's probably related to her physiological status that given time point.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
But we do see some differences. So in our study, we use a fixed time embryo transfer approach, and we see some small differences in luteal blood perfusion depending on whether that female showed estrus or not in response to the sync program. We transfer embryos in females that did not show heat, right? Regardless if she has a somewhat decent CL, she's getting an embryo for most programs that we're working with. But what we notice is that the ones that do show heat have a little bit higher blood perfusion than the ones that don't. So that tells me that, the follicular environment, or whenever she ovulated and how well that follicle grew, probably dictates to some extent, influences how much that CL, how much vascularization you're going to see in that CL. But again, there's not a whole lot of large scale studies done with that. Some smaller scale ones, but we don't really know the repeatability of that high luteal blood perfusion characteristic.
If we quickly go back to AI and think about the 30 to 50% of cows that don't end up calving to that AI, have you any closer to understanding what's happening to them? Are they like the embryos getting fertilized and just failing to implant, or are they being lost in? Are you any closer to? I mean, that's obviously the $1 million question, probably, or literally $1 billion question, probably. If we could get a higher conception rate.
Yeah. A lot of people working on that. We have always thought that fertilization rates are above 90% or equal to 90%. That depends on who you talk to. If you talk to an andrologist, he's going to say, nope, they're not. If you talk to an embryologist, he'll say, yes, they are. So it really depends on the person you're talking to. But what we see is that most of the cows that get exposed to a synchronization program, and they do respond to the synchronization protocol, they undergo fertilization, right? And then within that first week to 10 days, we see a lot of losses happening there. It depends on the data set you look at, but still, from the time fertilization occurred to the time we're doing our first preg check during those first 30 days, we're going from above 80% fertilization rate to 55-60% pregnancy rate. So a lot of those pregnancies are being lost, and we see that in the embryo transfer side of things, right? You go there and you put an embryo that we evaluated. We're really confident that embryo is viable when we put it in. But the reality is a lot of those cows are not going to establish a pregnancy by the time we're checking that pregnancy. So that tells us that there's a lot of pregnancy loss happening within those first 30 days. As we move forward past those 30 days, the amount of pregnancy loss that we see goes down, right? In the beef herd, we just compiled some data from I think 2,000 to 3,000 AI records that we had here in well-managed herds with a good biosecurity program. Talking about 2 to 4% pregnancy loss past 30 days, so very little. If you're talking about a situation with in vitro produced embryos, that pregnancy loss goes up. In dairy cows, it's closer to 20%. Beef cows, it's 10 to 15%, probably closer to 12 to 13% in those in vitro produced embryos past 30 days. So yeah, $1 million question. I don't think we're going to figure that out anytime soon.
No.
Because there's a lot of variation, right? We're usually very simplistic in the way that we describe these biological events, but what's happening there from a biology standpoint is really complex. So it's going to be very unlikely that we can fully mitigate those. There are a few things that we know influence the ability of those embryos to grow, elongate. We know the bull plays plays a role and so forth. But it's going to be a multifactorial. It's a multifactorial type of outcome, right? So we're not going to come up with a magic powder. We're going to feed cows, and we're going to get 100% pregnancy rates.
Yeah, and I guess the reality is that this is happening in natural programs as well. That we're losing. That's the reason we have cows that don't all get pregnant on the first cycle as well. We're losing those embryos are disappearing regardless of how they were conceived. Yeah.
And it's cool. It's conserved across several species, right? Humans is the same thing. We see that a lot in the couples that are struggling with fertility. If you go through an IVF round, you get an embryo, and the couple receives the woman receives an embryo. That doesn't mean she's going to establish a pregnancy. It's a lot of pregnancy loss happening for sure.
Yeah. The last thing would be good to chat about is the bull reproduction that you're doing a little bit of work in, and that's, I guess, one thing that we see a bit is bulls that have been overfed to make them look good at sale. What are the risks of a bull that's overfat in terms of its reproductive performance?
Yeah, I'll call it somewhat of a hot topic, not super hot. We've known that for a while, right? But that's a concern that we get a lot because those bulls are out there in the industry, right? There are some bull development programs that really push their bulls hard, and we want to push them hard, right? We want to see the bulls that have the genetic potential to grow, but at the same time, we got to be conscious that if we keep pushing those bulls excessively, right? And that word excessively is important, so people don't get over scared about getting bulls over conditioned. Like, we only start seeing issues with fertility is when they get like really, really over conditioned, right? So, but yeah, that happens in the industry, and yes, overnutrition in bulls that are over conditioned, they do have decreased fertility. So we did several different trials here now since I started here in Georgia. So ranging from just looking at historical BSE records in our bull development programs and working with some local veterinarians. It's quite interesting. Even in the really rudimentary way that we evaluate fertility in bulls, with the BSE, just, morphology and motility analysis, right? We see that if we sort bulls, that when we have a data set with about 800 bulls, that we sort them based on how much subcutaneous back fat thickness they had from under carcass ultrasound scanning, which was done about 30 days before the BSE. And it's very clear, after those bulls reach a certain amount of subcutaneous back fat, we see a spike in morphology defects. Okay, so when the veterinarian is coming in and doing the morphology assessments, not a whole lot of differences in motility, but in the morphology assessments, we pick up some differences. And what's interesting is that those differences are abrupt enough that they lead to a greater proportion of those fat bulls failing the BSE, right? So, which for the seed stock guy that is, investing a lot of money and is semen testing those bulls before those bulls go to a sale, it's a big deal, right? You go there and you fail a bull, and if some of those failures are coming from those bulls being overconditioned, that's something we need to address as an industry. So that's pretty clear, that relationship. And what's cool is that this is true even in bulls receiving the same diet, right? In those bull development programs that they get, exposed to the same environment for about 120 days, right? Yeah. The ones that came in to that environment already over conditioned, by the end of that performance program, they're really over conditioned, right?
Yeah.
And then they're more likely to fail. But also when we go there and we do control experiments, right? What I just told you were observational studies, right? Just exploring natural variation in how fat they were in the industry. But if we go there and we get our bulls from the university and we purposefully get them over conditioned to really understand the mechanism of what's happening, we generate the exact same phenotype, right? We see a decrease in sperm motility, mostly a decrease in sperm morphology. And that seems to be very, really, really consistent across different studies, not only from our group, but also other groups out there. One cool thing that we did, and we kind of try to take that a step further, and the rationale for that is that when you look at human fertility, one of the things that we see is for couples that are struggling with fertility, when you look at epidemiological data for fertility clinics in humans that use in vitro embryo production, right, IVF, to overcome infertility, there's an association between how obese the male is and the ability of that couple to become pregnant when they are in a fertility clinic. So they have decreased embryo production, but not only that, once they produce an embryo and they transfer that embryo, the woman is less likely to carry that pregnancy to term. So when we start seeing that and we think about the beef industry, we try to replicate that in bulls. And we saw some very similar results, right? So when we go there and get those bulls over conditioned and we use them in the IVF or in vitro embryo production system, and we've been working with the University of Florida on that, what we see is that there's a clear decrease in vitro embryo production out of those over conditioned bulls. And it's quite interesting, right? Because we think about the sperm as a DNA bullet, right? All it has to do is swim up and then fertilize the egg and it's done.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But what we've been learning is that the sperm itself plays some key roles in early embryonic development. And it seems like depending on the environment that sperm was exposed to, and in the context of our conversation here, if they came out of a bull that was over conditioned, there's some molecular changes happening in that sperm cell that is negatively impacting the ability of the embryo to develop. It's not only fertilizing, but also the ability of that embryo to develop, which is biologically quite interesting too.
Very, yeah. And presumably that's some sort of oxidative stress, like something happening to that cell through.
Yeah, we're currently doing some of that to try to understand, to gain some insight into the biology of what's happening as well.
Yeah, cool. Do you use bull breakdowns as the other thing that I guess that plagues industry a little bit, and the sort of anecdotal evidence, at least, that feeding young animals up to heavy weights puts a lot of pressure on structural traits. Do you see any of that happening in terms of, I guess, getting a bull that stays in a herd for a long time rather than for 2 or 3 years? If we can get 5 or 6 years out of that bull, it obviously helps the efficiency of that whole production system and buying less bulls.
It does. You're right on the spot there, right? If you think about the initial investment we have when we buy a bull, ideally want to dilute that out through several calf crops, right? The more calves that bull generates, the more likelihood is that the bull is going to be profitable in our system. And yes, we get that question a lot, right? So is the way we're developing bulls influencing the ability of those bulls, the longevity of those bulls? And I wish I had an objective, science-based answer to you, but we don't have that because it's just experimentally hard to test that. But we do hear that a lot from producers. They say that, sometimes bulls get pushed too hard, and a lot of that seems to be associated with structural issues later on in life. So if you physiologically makes sense, right? If you think about a bull that might be borderline acidotic, if they get pushed too hard during development, they might have some maybe subclinical laminitis or something like that. That once those bulls reach full mature body weight, those insults during early life in their, we'll call it structural soundness here, might manifest when they reach 1,800 pounds, 2,000 pounds. And that's when you go there and you see food problems. But I don't have true research data to support that, but we do hear that a lot from producers.
Yeah, we're in the same camp then. I don't have any evidence, but hear it a bit. But so
and the breeds are trying to address that, at least from a genetic standpoint. We've seen food scoring. Seed stock producers collecting food scoring information and that information being available for commercial producers. And in our development program, so we have a bull development program here in Georgia that we receive bulls from producers. And buyers they're very particular about checking feet. Because of that, they are concerned about it for sure.
Yeah, and that's a increasing trend here as well, and it's great to see. Some of the breeds having structural breeding values out there, and more we'll see that more and more, which is great because we can at least control the genetics aspect of that. I guess playing that out to its full extent, if you're looking after your bull, you got your bull paddock, and they're out there doing their thing, and obviously, is it best practice to keep them in in slightly lighter condition than what they might end up if they just sit there eating for the whatever it is 10 months of the year where they're not doing too much? Is it best practice to keep them a little bit leaner?
It depends on what you define leaner. Every time that I talk about the overcondition research that we've done here, I always put a disclaimer out there, like we are purposefully getting those bulls overconditioned, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I don't know what kind of body condition score scale do you guys use, if it's a 1-5 or 1-9.
Oh, both. So yeah.
Okay, so let's use a 1-9 scale here for what we're used to here. Like a bull, for you start seeing fertility issues, you're talking about bulls that pass a body condition score of 7. So those bulls with they're 6 or 6.5, they are just fine.
That's fit, not fit, not fat. Or,
yeah. And so and those bulls, they lose a lot of weight once you turn them out of breed cows. So you got to make sure that they're not extremely linear to begin with. So I like that bull to be in a decent body condition score, a little bit not towards the over condition side, but you need some body reserves there too. Like there are bulls that we lose 150 pounds, during a 70-day breeding season.
Yeah.
So we want them to have some body reserves. So if you think about bull management out of the breeding season, in a situation where you're using those young yearling bulls, and that's something we see a lot. You go there and you buy that bull comes in maybe more on the overconditioned side, and then it goes through their first breeding season, and then at the end of the breeding season, it lost a little bit of weight, and then you turn them out of the mature bulls, and sometimes they just graze and just have access to hay and minerals. You got to be mindful that the young bull is still growing as well.
Yeah.
Right. So, and we want that bull to develop fully, right? So from a structural standpoint. So it's important that we think about bull nutrition after the breeding season the same way we do think about that postpartum first calf heifer, right? We need to acknowledge that the requirements are different and then manage them accordingly depending on the quality of forage and kind of commodity you might have to supplement them. Just be mindful that they need more than your full-grown 3-4-year-old bulls.
Excellent. Some great tips there, Pedro. I think that might wrap it up. That's been a fantastic conversation. Heaps of takeaways for beef cattle producers out there. So, really appreciate your time. The last question we normally ask on the show, and I haven't given you pre-warning to it, which so it might be a bit rough, but we normally ask people what they've last changed their mind about.
Good question. Let me think about it here. What did I last change my mind about? I'm not going to talk about politics here. Things that you're hot right now.
No, none of us want to go there.
I think I'm trying to think about something cattle related and repro related. What I did change my mind. It was maybe not the last thing, but I think it's relevant to our conversation.
Yeah.
Like we get trained on those reproductive technologies, and they're great. They're outstanding, right? But one thing that I learned over the last few years is that a lot of producers do really well without them too, right? So, we talk about advantages of AI and how sometimes they're underutilized. It is underutilized, but there's a lot of space for a good quality natural service breeding program. And I've been switching my mindset on that, and actually using some synchronization with natural service from an applied standpoint. I think that has been very interesting to do and see how well it works. It is amazing when you get a group of well-managed cows and you combine a simple synchronization program, sometimes a one-shot prostaglandin or just a 7-day with a cedar. It is amazing what that does from a production standpoint and how well some of these commercial cow herds do in a system like this without necessarily using the AI component or the efficient insemination component of it.
Yeah. Excellent. That's great to draw that out. And that's why we asked the question, because you always get something slightly different. Just quickly on that before we do close it out, the bull power required in that, do you need more bulls? Like if you are synchronizing cows, you need a bit more bull power or not?
It depends on what bull power you have. So most of the studies that show a benefit of synchronizing versus not synchronizing a natural service setting, they use a 1:25, one bull for every 25 cows. And again, these are mature bulls that pass the breeding standards exam.
Yeah.
Right. So our general recommendation is if you're dealing with younger bulls, we use a general rule of thumb that is 1 cow for every month of age of that young bull. So if you're turning a bull out that is 15 months old, he should be able to breed 15 females, assuming he passed the breeding standards exam.
Yeah.
And then if they're 17, 18 months old, although once they reach 2 years of age, they're the same as a mature bull. But we try to be mindful whenever we're using those young, almost yearling bulls, right? When we're turning them out, they're super young. And we need to take it easy on them.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for your time, Pedro. I really appreciate all those insights, and look forward to following along and following your work and seeing what you discover over the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, and it's been a nice conversation, and we're happy to help.
Cheers. Thank you. Thanks again to Heinegger, who are proud world leaders in the manufacturing and supply of professional sheep shearing and clipping equipment. Thank you to MNSD Animal Health and Norflex Livestock Intelligence. They offer an extensive livestock product portfolio focused on animal health management, all backed up by exceptional service. We thank both of these companies for their ongoing support of the Head Shepherd podcast.